Welcome, everyone. My name is Meredith Langlitz, and I am the Programs Manager for the Archaeological Institute of America. Today, we are lucky enough to be able to tap into some in-house expertise as AIA Director of Programs, Dr. Ben Thomas, takes us on a virtual tour of some of the archaeological highlights of Belize. We're doing this to jog your memories and rekindle your appreciation for Belize's many archaeological wonders as we initiate a letter writing campaign over the next few days in advance of a U.S. Cultural Property Advisory Committee meeting later this month. At the meeting, the committee will review public testimony about experiences with Belizean cultural heritage as they consider whether to recommend renewing the bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Belize that prohibits the illegal importation of cultural objects from Belize into the United States. If you've been to Belize before, we'd love to get the webinar chat going, so feel free to jump in the chat and tell us about the sites you visited and when you went there. We are thrilled to be able to have Ben do this presentation and share some of his experiences in Belize. It just so happens that he earned his PhD in Mesoamerican archaeology after several seasons of archaeological work in the jungles and swamps of Belize, focusing specifically on Maya settlements along the spectacular and volatile Ceboom River. After he gives his presentation, I will jump back on to talk a little more about how you can submit a letter in support of protecting the archaeological sites of Belize. And then Ben and I will be joined by AIA Vice President for Cultural Heritage, Dr. Brian Daniels, to answer your questions. Finally, I would be remiss in not mentioning that we are able to do all of this because of the support of our members and donors. If you would like to join the AIA or contribute financially to help fund our mission to support archaeology and archaeologists, please see the links we are about to put up into the chat box. Are you ready to take it away, Ben?
Sure. Yes. Hello, everyone. You know what? I'm going to start a stopwatch just so I know that that's to force myself to stop in about half an hour. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Meredith, thank you for the introduction. As Meredith pointed out, I am the AIA's Director of Programs and a Mesoamerican archaeologist. I did my graduate work at Boston University and have done field work in both Guatemala and Belize and have traveled extensively through the region, including Mexico. My dissertation, as Meredith pointed out, focused on ancient Maya settlements along the Ceboom River in Belize. Now, I haven't been back to Belize in a few years, but the country and its archaeology holds a very special place in my heart. Belize is what convinced me that I needed to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist, something that I wasn't planning to be when I started my graduate work. So today I'm just going to touch on a couple things about Belizean archaeology, and then take a few minutes to talk about sort of my own personal experiences with the culture and archaeology of the country and of the Maya sites that I worked at in Belize. Okay, so here's a map of Belize for, on the left, a map of the Maya area, just to give you an idea of the region that we're talking about. I'm actually going to let me get my cursor and then I can point out the region I'm going to be talking about. So this, of course, is Belize. Here is a blow-up map of the country of Belize. I hope many of you joining us today have been to Belize. If not, I hope you visit soon. It is an incredible place, a beautiful country with a very rich and long history, and really has something for everyone, no matter what your interests. So whether it's cultural sites or ecotourism, there's plenty to do in Belize. So I would encourage everyone to visit. And I know now that all the COVID restrictions, I think, have been removed. So folks should be able to travel without too much problem. All right, some quick facts about Belize, especially for folks who are not familiar with the country and with the region. Belize borders, so it's in the southeastern kind of corner of the Yucatan Peninsula, bordered by Mexico and Guatemala. It has an area that is sort of slightly smaller than Massachusetts, so about 8,900 square miles. A population of just over 412,000 people. It's a tropical climate, has an extended rainy season, that seems to go from about May to November. I was fortunate enough in that most of the field work that I did in Belize was in the dry season between January and April or May. Physical features of Belize include sort of the northern, kind of the more flat area of the north, including the jungles and the swamps up north. To the south, you have the Maya Mountains, then the long coastline, and just off the coast is actually the second largest part of the second largest barrier reef in the world. Tourism is the #1 revenue generator for the country. And that barrier reef is an incredible attraction to people in scuba diving, snorkeling, fishing. One of the big draws to Belize. I think something that actually put Belize on the map even before the archaeology and its current sort of people's interest in things like ecotourism. It's a great area for birders, by the way. If you're a birder, Belize has hundreds of species that are either native to or stop by on their migration routes. So it is an incredible place to visit. And like I said, it has something for everyone. Belizean cultural heritage extends back in time to what is referred to as the Archaic period, but most people are familiar with the Maya in Belize, and that's mainly because of all the extant archaeological sites. The Maya settlements in the area date to at least as early as 1500 BC, so the period that we refer to as the pre-classic. And the Maya sites and Maya occupation continue into today, of course, with significant changes post-European contact and colonization. European contact begins, of course, after 1492, and sustained contact with Belize is probably starting around 1527, when the Spanish attention is focused on the Yucatan and a conquest of the Yucatan. English settlement and exploration of Belize and that region begins at around 1638. The British and Spanish are both laying claim to that land through the 17th and 18th centuries. Britain defeats Spain finally in the Battle of St. George's Key in 1798. By 1840, Belize becomes a British colony known as British Honduras and a crown colony in 1862. Belize achieves independence from the United Kingdom on 21st September 1981. Okay. So that's just to give you a little bit of an orientation to Belize, the country, the region, its physical features. But today we're going to be talking about Belizean archaeological heritage, the Maya, mainly the Maya heritage and Maya cultural sites in Belize, because that's what I'm most familiar with. If you look at any travel guide for Belize, or most travel guides will list around a dozen or so Maya sites that cannot be missed, or top 10 sites to visit. These are the things that you will hear of most commonly, but there are over 600 Maya sites spread all across the country. Sites dating all the way from the pre-classic period to the colonial era, sorry. So it's an incredibly rich and vibrant cultural heritage. And so what I thought I would do today is just sort of remind you of a couple of the sites or about a handful of sites. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own personal experience in Belize. Oh, actually, let me go back to that. And so that list that you see on that slide are some of the popular sites in Belize and some of the sites that people who have visited Belize may have been to. I've just listed them in alphabetical order right there. A couple of sites to point out. I mean, so Belize really, it's sort of spectacular archaeological remains. Beautiful sites, pyramids, palaces, plazas, residential structures. This is Altunha, a site that I think is visited by a lot of people. It's easy to get to. It's right off the highway. This is a site that was occupied as early as the pre-classic and reaches its height probably in the classic period between about 200 and 600 AD. A lot of those buildings that you will see today at the site are dated to that classic period. This site probably had, estimates vary from about 8,000 to 10,000 people at a time, which is kind of an interesting thing because today Belize only has about 412,000 people. But if you do sort of rough estimates of population densities at the time of the Maya, we're talking about well over 1 million people in this region. So a very densely populated area. Altunha is probably familiar to a lot of you because of the jade head. This is said to be a representation of the sun god Kinichahau and is the single largest jade object discovered in the Maya area. It was found at a site at Altunha, at a structure called B4, weighs about 10 pounds and is about 6 inches tall, and is in Belize at the museum today. The other reason why a lot of you may be familiar with with Altunha is that it is Temple B4, Temple of the Sun God, or the Temple of the Masonry Altars, is featured on the Belican beer bottle. So that is something that I think a lot of people have seen, even if they haven't been to the site, they've seen one of the buildings from the site. Other sites. So again, Belizean archaeological heritage, there's been work going on in Belize for decades, archaeological work that has included survey and excavation of sites. Sites like Altunha are well preserved and you can see it. It's easy to visit, maintained by the Institute of Archaeology and the government of Belize. Other sites are a little bit harder to get to. This is the site of Caracol. Still in the mountain Pine Ridge, Caracol. Not only has there been extensive excavations and research and survey at Caracol, it was recently, they did a huge LiDAR survey of the site and the region, exposing or uncovering in that sense many more sites, and allowing us to see that a lot of the sites that we have known about for decades are probably larger and more complex than we were thinking. Especially the tree cover in this region and the growth, the undergrowth or the growth along the ground makes it sometimes hard to see these sites and to find all the some of the more subtle features. And new technologies like LiDAR are helping us to see more of these sites and to realize how complex and how vast some of these sites are. The building, the main building at Caracol, the largest building at Caracol is Kana, or Sky Palace. It's the tallest man-made structure in Belize at about 141 feet. Other sites, so this one again, Caracol in the Mountain Pine Ridge, Altunha along sort of northern Belize, or sort of central Belize. Up on the very tip of Belize, where the New River and the Chetumal Bay meet, you have the site of Cerros. Cerros, I'm including that just because Cerros is kind of a unique site. It's a location on the tip of this peninsula, right on the water, and you can see the water of Chetumal Bay right behind it. It's also a late pre-classic site, so somewhere between 300 BC and 250 AD. And a site that a lot of the buildings are not actually built over by later construction, later periods. And so it's kind of a special site in that sense. One of the more famous buildings at Cerros is that structure 5C2, which you see in the corner, which has these incredible stucco masks. This is actually a great story of preservation. The site, when it was starting to be excavated, exposed these stucco masks that, of course, started to deteriorate when they were exposed to sort of the modern environmental conditions. And so the site was reburied, the building was reburied. What you're looking at actually is the site was excavated again, and a detailed cast was made of the facade of the building, and that's what you're looking at right now. The actual masks are behind that, preserved, and what you can see as a visitor to the site are these stucco masks that are exact replicas of what's behind it. Lumanai, another site that a lot of you probably have visited, and if you haven't been to Belize and you do go, this is one of the sites that you probably will visit. Is one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in the Maya region, and certainly in Belize. It's also one of a handful of sites that have retained their original name. Remains at this site include more colonial period structures, including a church and a sugar mill. It is also probably one of the most spectacular entrances, because you come up the river, turn around a bend, and you see this incredible site. This is actually looking from that pyramid that I just showed you towards the river. One of the more spectacular ways to enter a site, very dramatic and just beautiful. One of the most famous buildings at Lumanai is the Temple of the Masks, a building that has these beautiful stucco masks attached to it. Masks are about 13 feet tall, just to give you a sense of scale. Okay. Janantanich on the western edge of Belize, close to the border with Guatemala, so it's situated on a high ridge overlooking the Mopan River, a strategic location that would have allowed sort of control of trade and communication routes along this river. Again, this is the Castillo, or one of the tallest pyramid at Janantanich, that has this incredible frieze that's preserved. And this, again, what you're looking at is a cast of the original, which is preserved behind it. And again, just to show you this, just to mention sort of the variety of archaeological sites in Belize, from smaller pre-classic centers to these large urban centers, the kind of architecture that is there, and the kinds of steps that Belize has taken to preserve these sites. Remember, tourism is the main revenue generator for the sites. Hundreds and thousands of people visit these sites every year. That has an impact on the sites. So Belize has taken extraordinary measures to protect sites and to mitigate the influence and the sort of the effect of visitors sort of coming to the site in the numbers that actually end up seeing the site every year. Of course, these built-up sites are not the only sites in Belize. Belize is famous for its cave sites, including probably the most famous of all, Altunha Muknal, or ATM cave, which is famous for its crystallized maiden, which people argue is a sacrifice. Hard to say, but certainly is a preserved a skeleton that has been kind of has been crystallized and is now attached to the cave floor. In addition to cave sites and terrestrial sites, there are several underwater sites, including work that is being done by, currently being done by Heather McKillop out of Louisiana State University along the southern coast of Belize, where they have found some of the only known preserved wooden structures, preserved because the sites had been submerged, and so the wood was preserved, and they found this beautiful canoe that you see Heather and her colleagues holding in the picture to the right. Okay, just to give you a short, kind of a brief summary of the kind of archaeology that most people will encounter when they visit Belize. It's, again, over 600 sites. You will probably get a chance to visit, depending on how much time you have, a dozen or so. But that range, like I said, from sort of small centers to these large urban these centers. My own introduction to Belize and Belizean archaeology, like I said, when I started graduate school, I wasn't intending to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist. It was my first experience with Belizean archaeology that changed all that. And that first introduction was at a site called Khashog. Khashog is in the north of Belize, along at the edge of a swamp known as Pultwazer Swamp. I was coming in at the tail end of that project. I was introduced, and Khashog is a relatively modest farming village, but with some large structures, including a 13-meter pyramid at the main plaza, Plaza A, and several residential compounds, several of which I had the pleasure of excavating. The richness of the cultural materials that we were finding, the length of occupation, the incredible things that we were finding is what really convinced me to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist. But I wanted to talk about Khashog also because I wanted to highlight sort of another aspect of archaeological research in Belize as well. Most of what I've shown you and talked to you about have featured buildings and built structures. Khashog has an interesting set of features that are cultural all along the edge. So this is the land where Khashog's site is located. This is a swamp edge, and all along the swamp edge are these things that look like little fingers extending out of the swamp. Those are actually raised fields. Those are fields that were built by humans. Here is an aerial image of that same swamp edge, and these things that extend into the swamp, this is swamp, by the way. These are the raised fields, and we were able to, and I was able to participate in an extensive program of excavation in these fields. That is, again, a whole different type of archaeology, and one that was just incredible and fascinating. By the way, this white line, this is before we had drones. We couldn't afford aerial photography, flyovers and things. This white line is actually the tether to a balloon that we had, that we sent up there with a camera to get us these pictures. Those X's that you see were these large spots that we put on the field. And we tried to sort of get the balloon to hover over that so we could take pictures, and the X's were placed in such a way so that if you took pictures at all of the X's, we would get kind of a complete coverage of the swamp. We worked, the settlement itself is in the sugarcane plantation over here. The edge of the settlement is pretty thick growth that leads to the swamp. We had to cut these transects through the swamp, through the sort of the brush to get to the edge of the swamp and to these raised fields. Once you got there, this is what it looked like. Here is one of those raised fields. This is the water, the canals that are between the raised fields. These are the bridges that we made, bridges in quotes. That's what they were, palmetto poles that we cut down, palmetto trees that we cut down, and so sort of lined up the poles so we could walk across and over the water from one island to the next. Excavations look like this. This is a profile of one of those raised fields, and you can see the sort of the limestone, the buildup over the original limestone. By the way, this is all swamp, so the limestone is soft, not the hard limestone that you sort of expect on a terrestrial site. This is the buildup over it. This is the modern soil that you see the dark color. We were finding artifacts, including large stone tools, which we believe would have probably been used in the digging of these, in sort of the maintenance of these fields, including the digging of what we believe are the bottoms of canals or other stone tools. And here you'll see profile there. That is a canal bottom. By the way, you can see here that in the previous slide, you can see this is all wet. This was below the water level. So these excavations, for these excavations to happen, we had to have a water pump going the whole time, sucking the water out of the excavation as we excavated. When we left it at night and came back the next day, it would be full of water again. We would have to get all the water out to continue the excavation. Including stone tools, we found some more delicate artifacts, including these obsidian blade fragments to the left, and to the right are shell. These are marine shell that is coming from several miles away from the Caribbean, marine shell that have been carved into these little objects that we believe, because of the shell's connection to things like fertility, where we wonder if they were seeding the fields as an act, as an offering, as an act of devotion, and that may be what those remains are. So Khashog introduced me to Belizean archaeology and convinced me that I needed to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist. My own work featured was along the Ceboom River. Ceboom River is one of the large rivers in Belize. There's the New River, the Belize River. The Ceboom River is another major drainage. The area that we looked at was what was referred to as the Ceboom watershed, which is the Ceboom River, the main branch of it here. And two of its tributaries, Caves Branch and Indian Creek. The region is, it's a volatile river. It floods every year, and the flooding can be pretty severe. And when we were done wrapping up the project at Khashog and looking for a new area to kind of explore, the Ceboom presented itself as this ideal candidate because not a lot of archaeological work had been done there. And of course, that is an incredible attraction for an archaeologist to be the first, or relatively speaking, the first to get into this area, to be able to see the sites. And so that is what drew us to that area. We're curious about occupation along the Ceboom. It was sort of an archaeological void in our understanding of Maya occupation of Belize. And that's what took us to the Ceboom. So we started work there in the late 90s and continued all the way into the mid 2000s. I was done by about 2004, 2005, after which the project continued with others taking over, the different aspects of that project. All this, by the way, done under Patricia McInerney, who was my advisor at Boston University and the Boston University international programs. We took a field school of, we conducted a field school there, and so we took students to work with us along the Ceboom. The Ceboom environment is rough. This is some of the vegetation to show you. Here are trucks. We made a path. There's a path down to the river. There they are. It is thick. It's overgrown. And it is inhospitable. And I'll show you another picture. Everything in the tropics, as we learned walking around looking for sites along the Ceboom, everything in the tropics can defend itself, and things are not just and I'll show you images, because we don't have things just like, it's not just bamboo along the Ceboom, it's spiny bamboo. So the bamboo has these spines that you have to sort of avoid as you're trying to sort of do your survey along this region looking for the sites. So the Ceboom River was a relatively blank canvas for us, and we had to sort of do everything from kind of figuring out how, where occupation was, so where the settlements were, how far it extended along the Ceboom River, and then sort of find the sites, clear, map, and excavate. So it was a project that we sort of started out from ground zero. We had a chance to fly over the Ceboom in a small plane. The Ceboom gets its start in the south in the Maya Mountains, where it sort of, all the rainwater kind of flows down these rivulets, down these falls, getting to the middle reaches of the Ceboom, where the water coming off the kind of the granite Maya Mountains hits the limestone of the Yucatan and just goes nuts. The water dissolves soft limestone, creating these big meandering, creating this big sort of meandering path all the way down to the Caribbean. To the east to the east and south of the river, we had a karstic landscape, so a limestone landscape that was riddled with caves, a lot of the caves that were used by the Maya. So I'll show you a little bit of that as well. And to the north and west, it was fairly, not open, but more savanna-like environment. Still hard to get through, but a little bit less complicated than working in the south and the east. And eventually the river opens up into the Caribbean. So that was the environment of the Ceboom. We did a lot of work, of course, along the river edge. Canoeing to work was one of the fringe benefits of working along the Ceboom. The sites itself were hard to find. This is actually a site that probably the largest one along the Ceboom River that we discovered, a site known as the Hershey site, because it was on land that was at one point owned by the Hershey Corporation of Pennsylvania. The only reason, and here you can see part of the site, this is actually in a modern chocolate plantation. So Hershey had bought this, owned this site for a while. They were growing cacao, which they were then sending off to be processed in Pennsylvania. The site, by the time we got to there, had been sold and was owned by the Belize Citrus Limited Corporation. This is the Hershey site as it looked when we first encountered it and did some clearing, which is why you can see some opening there. Here's a three-dimensional reconstruction of the site. This is the largest pyramid at the site. That's also about 40-something feet, so like a 3-story building. There's a large plaza in front of it with these platforms and a couple other pretty large plaza groups that this one we were thinking would be sort of more of an elite residential complex. And then another interesting plaza that had this sort of triangular shape with a building on top. If you look at these, and I'm not sure if you can see that well in the slides, there is there's what looks like a hole on top of that. That is all looting damage. And that was one of the things that we noticed. No matter what size the site was, almost all these sites at some point had been vandalized, and people had come in there, dug up sites, and we don't know if anything was taken, but we do see the evidence for looters' trenches and for the damage that has been caused to these buildings by looters. This is another reason why protecting archaeological heritage and archaeological sites is critically important. We don't know what we lost. So what we are interpreting now is based on what we have found, but that is, again, it's what we have. And what we've lost is hard to sort of to figure out. That same pyramid that I showed you, or that pyramid that I showed you, so this right there, when we found it, looked like this. This is us actually walking over that pyramid to get an idea of the vegetation and the growth along the Ceboom. This is the stuff that we had to clear to be able to get down to the archaeology and the architecture at the site. Here is our surveyor trying to get points in the middle of the jungle, and you can see the kind of growth that we had to sort of deal with at the site. Like I said before, everything in the tropics defends itself. So bamboo is not just regular bamboo, it's spiny bamboo with these spines at all the joints that, if you were not careful, would rip the shirt right off your back as you were trying to survey looking for these sites. In addition, you had things like this, acacia with these thorns and spikes, the poisonwood tree, the sap is poisonous. And if you are allergic, you can react pretty badly to it. Otherwise, sometimes it's just sort of a little of an itch, like a poison oak or a poison ivy. And then, of course, the critters, lots of snakes and scorpions. I'm okay with snakes. I do not like scorpions. But even more bothersome than all that, of course, were the bugs, the mosquitoes, and the ticks. So survey work in the Ceboom was challenging. Environment was hard. Lots of flora and fauna to deal with, but just incredible, the archaeology that we were uncovering, the sites that we were discovering, and the things that we were able to tell about a relatively understudied space was just incredible. That is that pyramid that we were walking over, and the one that I have in that three-dimensional image, that is what it looks like once we cleared it. That big divot that you see there is part of the looters' damage to this pyramid. Now, what you're looking at actually is the interior of the pyramid. The really nice quarried facing stones have fallen off, and what you're looking at is the rubble interior of this pyramid that would have sort of made up the mass of the pyramid. And then on the outside, you would have seen the nice dressed stone. But this is looters' damage. When you get up close to the site, you still find lines of preserved stone, but you can see where the looters were sort of started to dig into this mound and disrupted quite a bit of what was going on. But you can see here underneath the fall, underneath the stones that have fallen, we still have preserved lines of architecture, walls of the structures that would have been there. Standing on top of the pyramid, you can see that plaza that I was talking about. There's the plaza floor, but these rather large platforms kind of surrounding it. Excavations at the Ceboom varied from sort of tiny sites that had a single mound to the sites like the Hershey site, which had multiple plaza groups, large pyramids, large platforms that had to be excavated. So our excavations would vary from little excavations in which you could have one person at the most to these larger excavations where you could have a dozen people or so working comfortably next to each other. This is an excavation along the front of a building in which we found a remarkable burial, preserved burial sort of below where they are digging in this picture. To show you sort of in sequence what one of these excavations looked like, I tossed in this slide. This is a smaller site that we had, a site called the Ocean site because it was on land owned by Mr. Ocean. Mr. Ocean, who was elderly when we met him, remembers the first plane that flew over the Belize, piloted by Charles Lindbergh. And so would tell us all these stories. We had, a fascinating guy. We worked with him. He was amused that we wanted to dig in his, what up to that point had been his sort of orchard plantation. He was more than happy to have us come in there and do some work. This is the site that we uncovered on his property. And this particular building was a really interesting excavation. The one that I've got the cursor over was a little stone building, it was one of the smaller buildings of the site, but it was fascinating because it had not only a lot of stone on the surface, but these two rather large stone monuments. Stone monuments typically associated with the elites, usually carved, and there are plenty of just amazing examples from Belize. These were plain and in a site that we just weren't expecting it to be at. The Ocean site didn't seem, it wasn't a big site. We didn't expect there to be some sort of elite personages there, but yet there were these stone monuments. They were not decorated. Doesn't mean that they weren't painted at some point, but this is what they looked like when we discovered it. The land has been cleared. Here's part of the mound. The other cool thing about this is as we did the excavation, we found the building behind the structure, which turned out to be a round building. This is unusual in Belize. We see it early in the pre-classic. We don't really see it that much in the classic period. And then towards the end of the classic period, we start to see these round structures again. And here is what that building looked like. This is, of course, just a quarter of it. More excavation was done in subsequent seasons. Here is the excavation that looked at like at the end of that season with the curved wall, stone monument, and that doorway, the actual doorway that led into the building, that is plaster floor that survives from the time period from the initial construction. In addition to the settlements that we were finding along the Ceboom, and there were about 20 of them. Before we got to the Ceboom, we knew of about 3 archaeological sites along the Ceboom that really hadn't been explored that much. One of which, in fact, had been discovered when a landowner was putting in a citrus orchard, and so the site had subsequently been destroyed, but they made a sort of rough map of it, and we rediscovered what that site was and did some excavation in that area. But the other 2 sites that we knew about before we got there had not really been excavated. We discovered another 18 or 19 sites, for a total of about 20 or 22 sites. In addition, across the river, we had a bunch of caves that we were working in. These are what the caves along the Ceboom River look like. These caves, people were not living in these caves, but they were certainly using them as places of pilgrimage, as places of worship. Things were moving in and out of the caves, stone formations were being taken out of the caves, and pottery and stone tools and things were being brought into the caves, we believe, for some sort of ritual or ceremony. The cave features themselves were spectacular, including stalactites, stalagmites, columns when a stalactite and a stalagmite meet, things like this, which are rimstone dams that now house little underground pools. The site was littered with artifacts, including fairly large stone manos and metates, so grindstones and broken pottery. There's also lots of evidence for burning. So some ritual that included grinding, pottery, and burning. We wonder if they're burning some sort of incense, if they're grinding something that is then subsequently burned or participated in as part of the ritual. We would find pottery and stone tools across all these caves. We mapped and explored about 18 of them. And again, like I said, no evidence of people living there, but a real use of these sites, including things, like I said, with the groundstone and these big vessels. In addition, we found things like knives, carved shell that was probably part of costuming. This is a whistle in the shape of a ball player, and we found other musical instruments, including a drum and a flute, that seems to indicate that these rituals, in addition to them processing and using some either food materials or incense, they have music, and the music, again, representative of what we know about Maya music, including percussion and wind instruments. So again, just a quick glimpse of archaeology in Belize to give you this idea that archaeology is sort of found all across the region, all across the country, goes from agricultural and sort of sites like what we were finding at Khashog to urban built landscapes like we have at Janantanij, all different scales of architecture and archaeology, and just an incredible amount of cultural history preserved, and one that is being studied actively. And that has always also been one of the reasons why Belize has been so attractive. They have encouraged education and research. And so there are multiple projects going on right now, including several field schools that allow students to get an opportunity to participate in these sort of cultural experiences. And again, the cultural heritage of Belize is finite and it's irreplaceable. So anything and everything that we can do to preserve the sites and to protect the cultural heritage of Belize is incredibly important. So I'm going to stop there, let Meredith jump back on again, and then we can take questions after. Thank you.
All right. All set there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ben. It's been 15 years since I had the opportunity to study abroad in Belize as an undergraduate. So I really enjoyed this walk down memory lane. I'm guessing quite a few of our audience members checked on airfare to Belize City while you were talking. But now we're going to change gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you about our advocacy campaign before asking Ben and Dr. Brian Daniels, the AIA's Vice President for Cultural Heritage, to join me to answer your questions. First of all, I would like to note, while we definitely took advantage of having an in-house expert to shine the spotlight on Belize today, you all should know that there are currently opportunities to write a letter for Belize and or Libya, depending on which countries you have experience with. These are slides that I'm putting up now. Can you all see the slides? Yeah, so these are slides now from the, actually, does it say sharing the slides?
You're sharing the slides, yeah.
Oh, they are, okay. These are slides from the how-to advocacy video we just posted to YouTube. But since I have you all here, I'm going to quickly walk through them. What we have coming up at the end of July is a meeting of the Cultural Property Advisory Committee. The President's Cultural Property Advisory Committee, or CPAC, is the American body empowered to make recommendations under the 1983 Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act, which is how the United States fulfills the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. The principal means of accomplishing this in the United States is through 5-year bilateral agreements between the US and other countries. Before these agreements are signed or renewed, CPAC reviews written testimony from the public to determine whether countries are doing their part to protect their archaeological heritage and participate in cultural exchange. And this is where all of you joining us today come in. Your letter need not be long or complex, but this is a time-sensitive task. Letters are due this coming Tuesday, July 19th by 11:59 p.m. Eastern. We have some easy and effective strategies for crafting powerful letters of support for the U.S. Cultural Property Advisory Committee that I'm about to share with you. It's great. It's in the chat right now. And you can get all this and some templates on the AIA website following that link. We recommend a 3-step approach to your letter. And I'm going to outline it here. But step 1 is to introduce yourself and talk about your connection to Belize or Libya. Since I've spent some time in Belize, I wrote my letter yesterday, and I talked about not only how I visited Belize as a student, but also about some of the cultural exchanges I've had with the country since then, including following the interactive dig at Khashog online and attending Heather McKillop's Archaeology Abridged talks earlier this spring. Cultural, scientific, and educational exchange between the US and the country the bilateral agreement is with is an important part of the committee's considerations. So step 2 is to share your experience to illustrate what Belize or Libya is already doing to protect its archaeological heritage. For example, in my letter about Belize, I talked about how when I visited the incredible Altunha McNall cave that Ben talked about and showed pictures of, the only permissible way to visit the site is with a licensed guide. I also mentioned how to visit the impressive and remote site of Archaeological. You have to sign in and out and drive with a vehicle convoy at an appointed time. You might remember other instances of signs at airports reminding passengers that taking home artifacts is illegal, or various mechanisms to secure access to sites. In step 3, you want to end your letter by expressing your support for the bilateral agreement, which is often also referred to as a memorandum of understanding. And that is it. You'll need to submit your letter via the regulations.gov website. Let me just show you a screenshot of that here. What you do is you go to the website, and then in the box you put in the docket. I think it's the docket number. So it's DOS-2022-0015. And as soon as you hit search, this Cultural Property Advisory Committee meeting box will come up, and you can follow the link there. You can submit anytime before 11:59 Eastern on Tuesday, July 19th. And you can type your letter into the comment box or upload it as a PDF. If you haven't copied it down already, check out the link in the chat for the AIA page with more information, where you can see sample letter templates and view our how-to video. I really hope you'll take a little bit of time in the next few days to use your voice to advocate for the preservation of archaeological sites in Belize and or Libya. We so appreciate you spending some time with us today, and I'm going to invite Ben and Brian to join me now to answer any questions you might have. Just a reminder, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and that'll help us keep track of all the questions. It's separate from the chat box. All right, I can stop sharing too.
I think we already have a few questions here.
All right.
And so some of these are more technical to Belize that I'm going to ask Ben to address.
So I've answered a few of them online. I've been, directly to people. I keep getting questions about La Milpa, and Norman Hammond is on here. Yes, my second, let's say I started work in 1995 in Belize, 1995 and 97. I was between Khashog and the Ceboom, and then in 1998, I worked at La Milpa in northwestern Belize, an incredible site that I just didn't have time to get to, Norman. But we could do a whole talk on just La Milpa because it was, I will say, it's still one of the most spectacular discoveries I've ever been worked on. Was a elite residence at La Milpa with preserved walls, red plaster floors, and a throne, which there is a picture of me on Facebook sitting on that throne, which I could have brought up. But yes, so La Milpa was another very influential site. I just didn't have time to mention it, Norman. But yeah.
I think that I'll also add in response to one of the questions that the AIA Tours has organized tours in the past to Belize. Right now, AIA Tours are just getting restarted following the pandemic. We're not entirely sure where the next tour to Belize will be. I don't know if you have any additional information on this, Ben, but I know that it's something that we've talked about and hoping that we'll see one in the near future.
Yeah, I don't know. AIA Tours hasn't done a tour to Belize in a few years, and I'm not sure if they have it on their itinerary, but there are other groups that do tours to Belize. I am not actually entirely familiar with the tours that go to Belize other than or to the region other than AIA Tours. And as Meredith just said, I am actually leading a tour to Guatemala, Mexico, and Honduras in January of 2023 with AIA Tours, but I'm not actually sure what the other companies. The best time to travel to Belize is not the rainy season. Anytime that's not the rainy season is okay. We were there a lot between January and April, which was a really sort of nice time to be in Belize. It was after the rainy season and hadn't gotten too hot by the end of it, by April. Yeah, so that's what I would say. That would any time in those months would be good. Number of Belizean artifacts. So there's a museum in Belize, and the Institute of Archaeology has a repository where a number of the objects are currently located. And then, so that's where, yes, there are museums in Belize that you will get to see, both in Belize City and in Belmopan, the capital, where you can see most of these artifacts from these various excavations in Belize.
So I think that there's a question about how much is the CPAC review a formality? Is there any real risk that the bilateral agreements won't be renewed? And the answer is yes, there is significant risk that the bilateral agreements won't be renewed. One of the bilateral agreements was not renewed recently with Nicaragua. And one of the bilateral, and more historically, there was a bilateral agreement with Canada that was not renewed. And there has been, I would say, additional concern in recent years that we may not see renewal of other bilateral agreements.
And you have they said any recommendations for museums as well as best times to visit Belize?
recommendations for museums. So the Museum of Belize in Belize City is the one that I would, that's the main one that where you would see most of the objects that are in country. See the question from Jane.
So there's a question, can we put some links on to CPAC on the AIA website, and perhaps also list some of the things that both Libya and Belize have done or are doing to help themselves combat looting? I can address some of these, some of these sort of right now, just a bit here. So under the statute, there are certain kinds of obligations that a country needs to undertake to help protect cultural heritage. Some of these are very basic things like passing a law, or having a system of licensed tour guides, or having a system of licensed excavations. And these are all specified by the international treaty. And so Ben mentioned many of these for Belize just in the middle of his talk, right? A licensed tour guide to go to the cave, needing to obtain excavation permits to do the kind of research that he did, in having a system of tour guides, having a system of archaeological parks. All of these are considered evidence under the treaty that a country is taking really important steps in order to safeguard its cultural heritage. We all know, just to speak on Libya for just a moment, we are all familiar with the kind of conflict that Libya has experienced over recent years, but there's been very strong collaboration between international archaeologists, the international archaeological community, and the different competing governments actually all agree on one thing, the preservation of cultural heritage. And so the only space internationally where the three competing governments actually sit in the same space is actually in meetings on the preservation of cultural heritage, and all three competing governments will do joint training exercises together.
Brian, did you see the questions of why weren't the bilateral agreements renewed?
So why weren't the bilateral agreements renewed? Much of the discussion about why the bilateral agreements aren't renewed oftentimes is very much a political decision and a lack of perceived support from members of the archaeological community concerned with preservation. And I will say there's a question, the AIA doesn't necessarily need to see copies of the letters. All of your letters will be visible on regulations.gov, including the AIA's letter when it's submitted. And so we'll read and look there, and you can read and look there too.
There's another archaeology related question about surveying along a riverside. Joyce, to answer your question, it is difficult. We had to kind of walk the entire river edge. We knew that most sites would be located within a certain distance of the river to make it easy for people to get down to the water, to get the resources that they needed for their canoes. And so there's sort of a margin on either side of the river that is kind of where we expect most sites to be. But once that is determined, then you actually physically have to walk the region. In this case, we divided the region into sections. We walked those regions with a machete in hand to clear the path as we went along. Sometimes the undergrowth is so thick that you don't realize you're on a structure until you start going uphill. So it was difficult, but then once you find a structure, you work from the known to the unknown, and you can sort of, because we were familiar with sort of settlement patterns, the Maya settlement patterns, how they built their houses, you could kind of predict where the next mound would be, where the next structure would be, and you could sort of work from the known to the unknown. So that's kind of how it was, but it was difficult. It was difficult and very hard to see in that environment.
I think there's maybe one final question. Is Ben, could you maybe speak to the experience, and actually, Meredith, you can speak to this too, about the experience of visiting Belizean museums and what that was like, compared to some of your other museum experiences in the United States and elsewhere.
So not being a museum expert in the sense of not being able to evaluate everything about how a museum approaches its collections and how it kind of displays them, the Belizean museums were always something that I found to be incredibly interesting and very high quality, let's say, for lack of a better term. In addition, we had a chance to visit some of the collections that the Institute of Archaeology has at Belmopan. And again, there is an abundance of material, a lot of which has to be stored, but it seemed like they were taking the right steps. I know that, to protect and to preserve the artifacts. The ones on display were good, but that's a sort of a non-museum expert look at it. Go ahead, Meredith.
Yeah, I'm gonna claim it's been 15 years, but I do have vague recollections, and I mean, this is exactly why the capital is in Belmopan and not Belize City, but the museum in Belize City has protections in place for protocols for hurricanes, I believe, and that is also why the main Institute of Archaeology's repository is in Belmopan, which is it was the capital is moved to the center because Belize is really in a hurricane zone, and that was a strategic move there to protect the artifacts as well.
So we're coming up on the hour, and I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank Ben, and I want to thank Meredith for sharing, their expertise. I want to thank Ben for doing such good research over the years in Belize, so that way we could actually, gain some sense of the highlights of Belizean archaeology, but also why we're looking to protect it, why we advocate as the AIA to be able to do this kind of work of protection in order to be able to do the research, but for everyone to be able to go to a place like Belize and to appreciate the archaeology and the past and have that come to life in the present.
Brian, just one question on that, like Joyce's question, which I think would be useful. What can people who live outside the US do?
Okay, so if you live outside the United States and you have visited Belize and you can speak to any of these issues about the protection of the archaeology in a country, you too can actually comment about what Belizeans are doing, what the country is doing, and what you have seen visibly. But thank you, Joyce. It's a good question.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And I hope we see letters from you on regulations.gov.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. All right, Brian, I'm going to have to end the webinar, then we can get on.